Welcome to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. We are here today with Joel Baden, who is professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School and an old friend and former professor of mine. We are so grateful, Joel, to have you with us today. We'll be starting off today. We'll be talking about the book of 1 Samuel. We'll record a second video with Joel talking about 2 Samuel, but for today, we're going to start in this first book and wanting to hear about the figures that we'll encounter, the characters that we'll encounter in this book, but also some about the theology behind the books and some of the historical and political context in this really colorful part of our scriptures. So, Joel, I wanted to start out by asking you to talk a little bit about the transition in leadership that we're seeing happen here. We've just finished the books of Joshua and Judges, and we're heading into this era when Israel will have a king. So tell us a little bit about what kingship means for Israel, how it arises, and also a little bit how the Bible feels about it or talks about it. How is this kind of colored by the authors of the text?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited to be here, especially nice to be able to spend some time with you, Margaret. So kingship is a funny phenomenon in Israel because it's like admittedly not native. Right? The text is very clear. This is not like a natural sort of social organization. They even talk about like we want a king like all the people around us. Everyone around us has a king. Why? And it seems clear to me, at least, that they're thinking about like the major civilizations around them. Israel's always essentially operating in the shadow of great empires or great kingdoms, one way or the other. It's Egypt, it's Assyria, it's Babylonia, it's someone, and at least according to the story, they've been sort of running themselves on a pretty local level. You guys may have already talked about the Book of Judges, but like even the Book of Judges, which has this appearance of national leadership, where like, in all of Israel had this judge who functions, it seems like a king, right? Like one person ruling everyone. It seems fairly clear that, in fact, the stories of the judges are really stories about like local tribal chieftains. Even in their own stories, they don't really operate nationally, right? The framing of the judges is a national sort of thing, but the individual stories are like very localized. And so we have to keep in mind, and this is like often the very hard part for people to wrap their heads around, is that the history of Israel and like the historical context behind the creation of the biblical stories isn't the same as the story of Israel's past told in the biblical stories, right? So let me unpack that a tiny bit. What I mean is, if we come into it thinking with the biblical narrative, so there was, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and the 12 tribes, and they were all one people in Egypt. And like there was one nation, but it was really like it was in 12, like one nation divided into 12 small states. That was always one Israel, and so and that was the way it was, the whole time. If we come in thinking that way, it becomes a little harder to understand what might be going on really in the book of Samuel, in the shift to kingship, because it feels like, like that's obviously the way it's always been trending. The actual history behind, the history of Israel behind the text is that, in fact, we want to start rather with a bunch of independent tribes who had maybe occasional contacts, overlap, some common language, some common religion, but didn't think of themselves as one nation of Israel, until after our period, right? Maybe until, or at least during the book of Samuel, right? Until the decision to come to kingship. So in a sense, kingship is aligned with like not just a change in like political leadership, but really a change in identity for the whole people, right? It's no longer this tribe and that tribe, and Judah in the south and whoever. It's suddenly it's like, I don't know, what if we all came together? And this is really that first moment of coming together, and that's the novelty that is being and the tension that's being explored in the book. What does it mean for us to go from individual tribes to one nation with one person in charge, and what would that being in charge even look like?
Is it because of threat from the outside, or do we have a sense of what, either from the book itself or from history, is it just to stay alive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It's presented that way in part. Part of this, as with Samuel, as with so many of the books that the first few books of the Bible, is a sort of combination of a bunch of different tellings of these stories. So there's different parts that have different emphases. And sometimes, the people just say, hey, wouldn't it be great to have a king? And sometimes it's clear that, in fact, how does Saul get to be king? Saul gets to be king, at least according to one strand of the story, precisely as you said, Matt, because there's these Philistines who are threatening. And they've been threatening for a long time, historically. But I do think that's the thing that was the final push. The impetus to really have a king was, we need to get sort of a common defense system in place here. The Philistines were a far more powerful people, and Israel was, as long as it was a bunch of independent little tribes, pretty easy pickings for the Philistines.
Tell us a little bit more about the Philistines. Where did they come from? What are they like? What is the nature of this particular relationship or threat?
The main thing we know is that they were super uncouth and
had bad taste.
Right. They had terrible taste.
Kind of like Canadians, you're saying, right? Or
wow,
something?
Matt.
Oh, that felt like a local fight. I don't want to get involved.
Yeah.
I don't know, like Yankees fans.
Yeah.
So no, they were, obviously that's we're joking about the sort of the common use of the term. The Philistines are people who arrived in this area in the Levant, along the shore of the Mediterranean, probably sometime around the 12th century BC. Having come there as a result, probably in the long run, of climate change. That probably created a whole bunch of political instability in the Mediterranean region and drove these a number of groups of people who all get lumped under the term Philistine, but drove them all out of their native homelands, probably in the Mediterranean, near Greece and Sicily and various places. And some of their names, the names of their people groups, still reflect their origins in fun ways. And arrived in Egypt and along the coast of the Mediterranean, the Levantine coast, around the 12th century. And it sort of swarmed in, took over land, and had this vibrant culture. They were culturally much more advanced than certainly than the nascent Israelite peoples, and were it seems relatively aggressive. I mean, we get that from the biblical story, so I don't know how much to trust it really. But they had, a number of very strong city-state polities, some of which we know about: Ashkelon and Gaza, and the Gat where Goliath is from, and all of these little pockets down along the coast. And though we can't say too much about, they become sort of paradigmatic bad guys in the Bible. So we don't get a great picture of them from the Bible. We know much more about Philistine culture from archaeology than we do from the biblical text, which is true also of the Canaanites, who are also paradigmatically bad guys and have no personality other than the other.
That's been a repeating theme for us, actually. Who's the paradigmatic bad guy in each of these chapters of the story? And here it does seem like it's the Philistines who are okay. Yeah.
But I mean, they were a legit political presence, and it's seemingly, a legit military threat. I don't think they were looking to take over. They weren't looking to conquer, but I think there was a lot of I mean, I described it as a lot of raiding. It seems to be like the Philistines would come and, steal your crops, and like, and they sort of they had the freedom to do so. They were just a little more advanced.
Okay, well, thank you. It's helpful to get some kind of backdrop to the geopolitical situation at the time.
Yeah.
Let's look at some of the figures in this book in 1 Samuel. The first one really being the one that the book is named after, Samuel, who's not a king, but who plays this really significant role in this institution of kingship. What should we know about him? What kind of figure is he, and what role is he playing here?
Yeah, Samuel's wonderfully mixed, because, as you say, he has this clearly a political role. Which is the side of him that really belongs to like the judge's side, right? Samuel is the last judge, and it says, he operates as judge in Israel, and it tells us like this, sort of like the circuit he took. He was like the first circuit judge, right? He went from here to here to here, and like his various places that he popped in on, and so he was a local political ruler, the same way that the judges were. He's also obviously known to us as a prophetic figure. And I think in our heads, we often are like, well, you're either a prophet or a judge, dude. Like, pick one. But it's not actually so uncommon for these figures in the world. I mean, someone like Deborah, who is a judge and a prophet also. These roles can intermingle, especially because the prophetic role is also inherently political in a sense. We again tend to like think of prophets in this like broader, like floating above the cares of the real world sort of thing. But of course, that's not at all what biblical prophecy was like. Especially the prophets who show up in our narratives like this, who are almost always engaged with, with the political times in dispute with the political leaders of their time. You think about Elijah and Elisha and Deborah, and I mean there are plenty of them who are doing that kind of work. Samuel. I also want to make sure, like, Samuel's also a literary figure, right? Samuel. We can talk about like, well, what would the roles be like as social political reality? But Samuel is a literary figure who accomplishes literary ends, right? He is the transitional figure from the judges to kings. And if he's not going to be a king, but is still going to retain power, what does that look, some sort of authority? What does that look like? Well, in the time of kings, that looked like prophecy, right? Like the divinely ordained non-king power figure was a prophet. And or a priest, and Samuel's that too, right? Like Samuel, who grows up, with Eli in the temple. So Samuel is configured in our text as this transitional figure who is, again, and there's a few of them. Moses does the same thing, right? Moses is a priest and a king and a prophet and a tribal elder, right? Because he needs to play a certain role in transitioning Israel from one stage to another.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, comparing that multiple rules. Yeah, Matt, looks like you got a question here.
So is that something unique in Israel to have a prophetic figure in the royal court? And that will become more and more the case with David and then into the writing prophets. But
I mean, I don't think that it's hard, because like prophets in Israel, we know there are prophets all over the place, right? There are people who have the title of prophet who do prophetic things in Mesopotamia and in Egypt to a certain degree, and presumably elsewhere, in some of the sort of like the smaller little, the Arameans or the Moabites or the Ammonites. I assume they had similar stuff going on, even if we have much less record of it.
Yeah.
But Israelite prophecy isn't exactly the same as the prophecy that shows up elsewhere. Certainly we have, across the Near East, the phenomenon of prophecy appears in a whole variety of guises, often, in a political sense also, as participating in some kind of, is an Israelite prophet so different in kind from, say, the Mesopotamian king who asks for, some kind of what we would call like magic or like sorcery, or like to tell him whether he should go to war or not, right? What we have all over the place is kings who rely on intermediaries to the divinity, to the deity or deities, in order to help them make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And Israelite prophets are, I think, part of that same broader phenomenon. It appears in different forms in different cultures.
That's helpful. Thanks.
There's also on the other hand, this sort of role as the prophet as the conscience of the king, of prophets not just offering sort of strategic support, but also critique. Do you see that elsewhere? Is that a uniquely Israelite thing?
Yeah, I will admit I don't know of any like super great examples of that from elsewhere, which may simply be my failing as a non-expert in non-Israelite prophecy. But you're right. I mean, the critique of the king. I have to admit here, I also wonder. I always wonder this. I always wonder, to what extent are we conflating the way that the Bible presents things with the way that things actually work? Which is to say, the biblical text, right? The books of the prophets are obviously concerned with elevating the status of their main characters. So we can see Isaiah, for example, like really getting in the face of various kings. Was Isaiah the prophet really getting in the face of various kings? I don't know, but like I can understand why the book would want to make it seem that way. And in the history that we're reading here too, again with Samuel, with Elijah, with Elisha, with these prophets, prophetic figures who are very antagonistic toward the kings, they're always antagonistic, or they always present challenges that happen to conform precisely to the sort of theological principles of the books in which they're found. You know what I mean? Like, when we're reading here in Samuel, we're in the middle of what's called the Deuteronomistic history, right? Which is, this from Joshua through Kings, all of which is colored by an idea that idolatry is wrong, and correct worship of the deity is the most important thing, and you're not supposed to align with the foreign nations, and like there's this whole package of clear Deuteronomistic ideals that all these books come back to again and again. Well, I mean, what do you think? When Samuel yells at Saul, it's like, well, you didn't obey, right? You didn't obey in which way? You didn't eliminate the king who you were supposed to eliminate based on the laws of Deuteronomy. And when Elisha and Elijah get mad at kings, like, well, what are you doing wrong, right? You're worshiping foreign gods. You're marrying the wrong woman. It's all the same package of stuff. Mm-hmm. So the critique is real in the text, and certainly, as it's going back to our earlier point, it certainly continues to complicate the notion of kingship, which is to say, I think that what is worrisome for the Bible or for the biblical text that we're looking at is the question of where does the ultimate authority lie? And prophets have the more direct, at least in the presentation of the text, have more direct access to the deity than the king does. And so they present the divine critique of kingship, which reminds us constantly that kings are responsible to a higher power. That higher power, in fact, being God, but specifically God as manifested in the laws, specifically of Deuteronomy. Right? Like that's the way the judgment works.
Yeah.
No.
And now this image in my head of like yelling at a presidential motorcade from a crowd in the distance and then going home and writing down, I confronted the president today, as the prophet,
Sure.
Right. Right. Or I mean, honestly, like we can think today of, I'm sure, plenty of examples where, somebody within a presidential administration writes a memoir about all the ways that they stood up to and challenged, perhaps were overruled, but like they took their moral stand. And that's what their memoir is meant to push. And the official record might not show that. Yeah. I think it's probably something similar.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a helpful reminder that it's perspectives all the way down here, and that's something we'll encounter just again and again throughout this study. So let's talk about the first of these kings. Let's talk about Saul. And what was Saul like as a king from whatever vantage point we can get through the biblical text? I think we just sort of think of him as this kind of the first king before David. He gets knocked down out of the way, and then and now David's king. But tell us more about Saul. What's he up to?
Poor guy.
Yeah.
Right, like, how you've got a story in which Saul is manifestly the first king, but you've got a tradition and a legacy in which David is manifestly the first king. Right? Like, Saul's like the trial king that doesn't work so well. I mean, in fact, the way that Saul is depicted in the text is barely as king. Right? He's really still kind of just like a glorified judge, which is to say, he's still very much a local leader. Right? He is, he's kind of chosen to be leader up in the north. Right? We have to keep in mind, for the vast majority of Israel's history, right? You have to remember that there's like the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and the northern kingdom of Israel is still a bunch of tribes, at least for a while. But the separation between the two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, is like not the exception; it's the rule. But the exception is, and we'll get there. Right? The exception is David and Solomon. And again, like the biblical story has convinced us all that, like, oh no, it was always one nation that then split. That it was never one nation that split. It was always a split that was artificially joined for a little bit. It's less like I don't have a great example. It's more like Czechoslovakia than anything else. You know what I mean? Like, it's like different peoples who were shoved together politically and then eventually fell back apart because they never really belonged that way. So, all that to say, Saul is king in the north, or Saul is, a judge ruling in the north. And I do think, as we talked about, like the threat of the Philistines is what drives a sort of broader Israelite realization that someone needs to take over. It seems to me from the text relatively clear, just for the purpose of beating the Philistines. Right? It's not even super clear that that Saul was meant to be a long-term solution, or that this was meant to inaugurate. I mean, certainly one of the main things we think of with like kingship is that it's passed down to the son, right? The next in line. I'm not so sure that when Saul was made king, that idea of kingship was in anyone's mind, really. Saul goes out and beats the Philistines, and then like goes back to his little he rules out of a table in his garden. It sounds like.
Yeah.
He sits there and he's got some people around. He's got like a general, and there's no administrative apparatus. Again, we can compare this, looking ahead, you can compare it with what was said about Solomon.
Yeah.
Who has a massive administrative apparatus and is, levying workers from all over his kingdom. Saul has none of that. Saul is a military figure first and foremost, not an administrator. And as far as I can tell, he does his job exactly the way he's supposed to. This is why I said poor guy at the beginning. Like, does Saul do anything really wrong? The text sort of like comes up with a pretense.
Yeah.
Right?
It doesn't slay everyone he's supposed to.
Yeah.
Say again?
No, he doesn't slay everybody he's supposed to.
Right. But he definitely wins the wars he's supposed to.
Yeah.
And he seems like a totally good guy. And I mean, we could talk as we get into the David material more. We could talk about the relationship between David and Saul and how Saul gets portrayed as a bad guy. But I think of Saul a little bit the way I think of Esau, which is to say, somebody who has, over the course of tradition, come to get a bad rap, but who, even in the story, is probably like decent and does the right thing almost all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even in both cases when they try and kill the actual protagonist, right? Like Esau tries to kill Jacob, and we're like, you can't, like that. We're Jacob, you can't do that. But I don't really blame Esau for at least expressing the desire. Right?
Yeah.
And again, we'll talk about it more. But Saul the same, right? We look at like trying to kill David. How could he? But then when you read the story, you're like, I see how he could.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, maybe he wasn't so wrong.
Well, we've got just a couple minutes more for this video on 1 Samuel, but let's turn towards sort of how David appears on the scene, and then that relationship between David and Saul? What's David's origin story, and how does that get told?
Yeah. So this is a great example. The David origin story is a great example of, and I was saying earlier, about how there's multiple strands going on in a single, ostensibly a single story. Where does this kid come from? Well, it depends which chapter you read. We're talking about 1 Samuel 16 and 17 are the two big ones. 16 is the first place where he appears on the scene, right? We've already gotten the story of how Saul is destined not to keep the kingship, right? So the text has already set us up for this. And in chapter 16, following on that, you get Samuel, who is sort of told to go find the next king, find the guy after the man after God's own heart, who is going to take over for Saul. And you get this, like, the Cinderella story, right? He goes to the house, he goes to Jesse's house, and he's like, show me all your kids. And like all the 7 kids come out, and he's like, this ain't in it. Where's the one who's sweeping up the ashes in the fireplace and talking to the birds? And like, that's David. And you get this private anointing scene where Samuel and the only people who know that David is king are Samuel and David's family. And that's like, that's the way that the text introduces us to, okay, this is going to be the next guy. And at the end of 16, we pick up on the Saul is being oppressed by this divine spirit and needs somebody to come soothe him. And David shows up as this lyre playing kid who like soothes Saul with his music. And that's okay. So now we understand. So he was privately anointed, and then he ends up in Saul's court, and you can kind of see like these paths are going to converge, and it's all good. And then you turn to chapter 17, which is the Goliath bit. David's brothers go out to battle against Goliath, and they're at war with Saul in the field. And David, who at the end of the previous chapter was not just Saul's lyre player, but also had been appointed as Saul's arms bearer. So David's job at the end of 16 is to bear arms, like to carry Saul's armor around. And here we are at the beginning of 17, and David's brothers are all with Saul in the field in battle, and David's at home, like tending the sheep. You're like, what? You would think this would be the one time when he should be carrying Saul's armor, was when Saul was actually fighting. But no, he's back at home for some reason. And then, he goes to check on his brothers, right? Like, and that's the story. That's how does David end up fighting Goliath? Well, he went to check on his brothers, and they were all being like, they were all like being scaredy cats about it, and nobody wanted to fight him. And so David was like, all right, I'll do it. And we get the whole battle against Goliath, at the end of which Saul turns to his general and goes, who's this kid? And you want to be like, he's your arms bearer who plays the lyre for you every day. What do you mean? Like, and then Saul sends a note to David's father and is like, I would like to take him on into my employment. And you'd think that Jesse would be like, cool, I thought we did this already. Yeah. But they're two distinct, non-aligned origin stories for David, both of which are meant to explain to us how this kid from nowhere ever ended up in Saul's court in the first place. How does he end up anywhere near the kingship? He's not from the same part of town, right? He's from the south. He's from Judah. Saul's from the north. How does this nothing kid end up in anywhere near the throne? And then the rest of the story is going to be, and how did he then get from near the throne to on the throne? But again, like we're not talking so much here about. I don't want to talk about historical reality. Like I think there's some underlying truth here which is that David, who it seems was definitely from Judah, from the south, definitely ended up proximate to the throne. But the story goes to great lengths, and we'll talk about this when we talk about David more fully. The story goes to great lengths to make it clear that like it was totally by chance, either by the divine favor or by pure happenstance or by active bravery. But like it wasn't on purpose, right? David, he just happened to end up there, right? Because so much of this story is like Saul was the rightful king, and then David, who has no right to be the king, becomes the rightful king. And that there's a lot of effort gone to explain that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Joel, thank you so much for this tour through First Samuel. We will, I'm sure, be continuing to look at David as a figure in our next video. But we are really, really grateful to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.